government doesn't want to release a record, they can always just make a bogus Section 19 claim, like they did in this case, and then kick the can down the road for a couple of years. And that's a problem, because if a piece of information becomes stale, it becomes less damaging to the government.
Hey everyone, it's Franco Terrazzano, and you're listening to the Canadian Taxpayers Podcast. I'm here in Ottawa as your federal director and spokesperson. I'm here with our investigative journalist, Mr. Ryan Thorpe. Ryan, the mystery is finally solved of who it was in the government who stayed in that fancy, luxurious, $6,000 per night hotel room during the Queen's funeral in London, England last fall. Why don't you update our supporters on what we know now?
Yeah, for sure, Franco. So I got to admit, I think deep down, most Canadians kind of already knew the truth on this one. And the answer is that it was Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. He's the one who stayed in the River Suite, the $6,000 per night hotel room at the Corinthia Hotel. Yes, surprise, surprise. And it took Trudeau until March 23rd to fess up. And the only reason he told the truth on this is because the CTF, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, filed a legal challenge to force the government to be honest with Canadians. And knowing he was going to lose, Trudeau tried to bury the story in a bad news dump when U.S. President Joe Biden came to Ottawa late last month. So now that the government's attempt to hide the truth from Canadians has failed, we can report that Justin Trudeau billed taxpayers for a 5-night stay in the $6,000 a night luxury suite that features a marble bathroom and butler service. And all told, it cost Canadian taxpayers more than $30,000.
Yeah, I mean, you never had to be Sherlock Holmes to figure out this mystery, right? Especially when the Governor General, Mary Simon, was like, no, wasn't me, folks. Ease up. Wasn't me. It was pretty clear who it was. But here's the thing, right? This happened last fall. It took him all the way until March to finally come clean with taxpayers. And the reason he did, as Ryan said, is because the CTF launched a legal challenge. And we were able to do that because of our supporters, you listening to this, who took action, who were not going to let these bureaucrats off the hook, who were trying to withhold information from you. So Ryan, why don't you kind of like go back through the nitty gritty of what really happened, of the CTF's legal challenge that forced Trudeau to come clean with taxpayers?
For sure, yeah. So as you mentioned, this began last fall when Canada sent a delegation to Queen Elizabeth II's state funeral in London, and that was in September. So soon after, the Toronto Sun did some great digging on this, and they broke the news that the trip had cost taxpayers about $400,000 in hotel costs alone, and that included this 5-night stay in the River Suite. But the government and the Prime Minister's office refused to say who it was that had billed taxpayers for this. And political staffers in Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly's office even went so far as to instruct bureaucrats not to respond to media requests. So that's why the CTF filed an access to information request seeking the truth. But before releasing the records to us, the government redacted Trudeau's name. So the CTF then filed a complaint with the Office of the Information Commissioner and launched a legal challenge seeking to compel the government to be honest with Canadians. And I think what happened here is obvious. Trudeau and the government knew the CTF wasn't going to go away, and that ultimately they didn't have a leg to stand on in court. So they leaked the answer to the press on March 23rd, just as Biden came to town. And, as a former Canadian newspaper reporter, I can tell you that this is what we call a bad news dump. And this was a textbook example of it. So Trudeau hoped that having Biden in town would distract from the fact that he billed Canadian taxpayers, many of whom are struggling just to keep their heads above water right now. He billed them tens of thousands of dollars for a luxury hotel suite.
Like everyone listening, I really need to stress just how important it was for our supporters to take action, because the government was trying to violate a very important principle of transparency. And that principle is, look, if you spend our money, you're using taxpayers' money. You have to come clean with taxpayers on how it was spent. They're trying to avoid this clear principle of transparency. Bureaucrats were trying to withhold information, bend the rules, and our CTF supporters took action. We launched that legal challenge, and Trudeau knew he was going to lose in court eventually, so he had to leak the story. He had to get it out there, so he tried to bury it, but it was all because of our CTF supporters taking action. Now, Ryan, the latest claim of the day from the Trudeau government, from the Prime Minister's office is, well, $6,000 per night in a hotel room. We had to spend that money because security costs. What do you say about that?
Yeah, so this is the latest line from the PMO that it's been taking to try and defend itself. But I've got to be honest, that argument doesn't really pass scrutiny. So there's a couple of things here. First things, $6,000 a night is quite expensive for a hotel. And I can guarantee you that most Canadian taxpayers have never stayed anywhere that fancy or that cost that much.
Hold on, Ryan, did you say quite expensive? Is that not the understatement of the decade?
Yeah, I might have undersold that one a little bit. It's very expensive, and it's worth pointing out that other members of the Canadian delegation, which includes Governor General Mary Simon, there was 2 past Governor Generals, 4 ex-prime ministers, they were all put up, at very classy but less costly digs. Other 5-star hotels in the area, including the Four Seasons and the Shangri-La, all had rooms available for significantly less money. So no one here is suggesting that the PM had to stay at the Motel 6 out by the airport. There was other options. But now the PMO is blaming the RCMP and saying, we needed multi-rooms in this suite to address security concerns. And that's why they had to go with this $6,000 per night room. But the follow-up question is obvious, right? So if that were true, why did the government go to such great lengths to hide the truth from Canadians for so long, right? Why wouldn't Trudeau have just come out and said it was because of security costs right away and immediately put this story to bed 5 months ago?
Yeah, and that's not what happened, right? They essentially stonewalled the press. They didn't give the press any answers like this, that's for sure. And then what? During question period, they dodged all these different types of questions. I'm like thinking of dodgeball in my head right now. And then not just that, right? There was reports of political staffers telling bureaucrats to not give the full extent of the story to the public, right? And then not just that, once we filed our access to information request, the response, they wrote down Justin Trudeau's name and then they blacked it out. So if this was truly about security costs, Ryan, you and me, we've never been a prime minister before. We've never worked as a staffer to a prime minister. But, let's just use some simple logic here. If it really were for security costs and it was that easy to make the story go away, why wouldn't you just be honest and upfront right away rather than giving the story legs because you weren't fessing up? So, Ryan, I do want to shift gears slightly here, though. I know you've been talking to some of the experts that really know the access to information laws in Canada really well. So what have they been telling you with respect to this story?
Yeah, that's right. So last week, I spoke to several access to information experts because I was just curious what they thought of the CTF's court challenge. And also what the government had done in response to it. So access to information laws in Canada are pretty simple. If the government has a document, a citizen can request it, and the government is legally obligated to release it unless there's a specific exemption in the legislation to justify withholding it. So they have to have a good reason. And when they blacked out Trudeau's name, the government pointed to 2 sections, 16.2 and 19.1 of the Access to Information Act. And those clauses relate to security, as we were discussing, and personal information. So the security claim made no sense. Like, this was an event that had happened months earlier. So unless someone was going to travel back in time, Trudeau wasn't under any sort of ongoing security threats. And the personal information clause didn't make much sense either, because we were talking about a public official who was spending public money. And that's not a private matter. That's a matter of public interest. So I spoke with Michel Drapeau, who's a lawyer and a leading expert on access to information in Canada. And he said that this is something the government does often, right? They point to Section 19, citing personal information when refusing to disclose a record. That forces citizens or organizations like the Canadian Taxpayers Federation to then file a complaint with the Office of the Information Commissioner, which usually takes about 2 years to resolve. So basically, if the government doesn't want to release a record, they can always just make a bogus Section 19 claim, like they did in this case, and then kick the can down the road for a couple of years. And that's a problem, because if a piece of information becomes stale, it becomes less damaging to the government.
Yeah, that security claim was always just absolutely bogus. It like never passed the sniff test, right? They were staying in the hotel like months and months and months and months before. So like, unless you're worried that the Terminator is going to go back in time, unless you're worried about that, then I'm pretty sure we can be safe and release the information to taxpayers. Let's stay on this line of reasoning though for a quick second, because I want to hear from you what those experts were saying about Canada's access to information system more broadly.
Yeah, I mean, the simple answer is it's broken. So since 2015, since Trudeau came into office, the number of complaints filed annually to the Office of the Information Commissioner has skyrocketed. In 2015, the OIC received 2,036 complaints. By 2021, that number had jumped to 6,945. So that's an increase of 241%, which means that more and more Canadians are pushing back against lengthy delays, heavy-handed redactions, and the refusal to release records. And in 2015, Trudeau promised sweeping reforms to Canada's access to information regime. And to date, none of those campaign promises have been kept. And when the government's long-awaited multi-year review of the access to information system finally wrapped up last fall, the final report contained not a single recommendation for reform, not even one. And why does this matter? Because access to information is how groups like the CTF and citizens, Canadians more broadly, that's how we hold government accountable. It's how we get information on what the government is up to and how it's spending our money. And the fact that Canada's access to information system is broken benefits politicians and it hurts the public. And that's why, despite all of these promises from Trudeau for various reforms, there hasn't been. It's been little to nothing on that front.
Yeah. And hey, everyone listening, like, I really can't stress this enough. Like, this is a big win for taxpayers. It's a very important principle of transparency that politicians need to know when they may waste your money, they're going to be held accountable and they're going to have to look you in the eye and explain to you why they wasted the money. So this is a very important victory for transparency. And folks, like, make no mistake about it. I just want to thank you guys for taking action out there. If it weren't for you and your support of the CTF, then we wouldn't have been able to launch that legal challenge. And there is no way that Trudeau would have fessed up because other than the only reason I'm sorry is because you guys forced him. We launched a legal challenge. He knew he was going to lose in court and be required to make it public. So he eventually did fess up and try to bury the story when President Biden was coming to town. And again, I just want to pump your tires, all you listeners and watchers out there, because if it wasn't for your action, we still wouldn't know for sure who stayed in that room.